Today we are going to be talking about the Equality Act and kind of what that means for women's rights and what that means if it does get passed.
The Equality Act is an amendment to existing civil rights law that redefines sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So today we have with us Lauren, who is the legal counselor for Wolf, to talk to us about what some of the intricacies of this law are going to actually mean. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about, Lauren, is what actually is discrimination legally in the United States, and how is that defined and or changed by the Equality Act?
Yeah. So it's essentially discrimination is just treating, somebody differently than somebody else. And I think because we use it in civil rights law, we have a sense that it's a negative word inherently, but discriminating is not, it's arbitrary, or they used to say invidious discrimination, that's what's really a negative thing. Recognition of different characteristics is not necessarily considered negative. And we see that in sex segregated spaces and things like that. But to prohibit discrimination on the basis of a characteristic, you're not protecting a particular group. So you're not, when you say, protecting people on the basis of sex, that doesn't mean that women are the protected group. Historically, women and girls have been the beneficiary of prohibitions on discrimination on the basis of sex, but it is just as illegal to discriminate against men and boys. And I think that's one thing that really bears keeping in mind when we look at this stuff and we anticipate what kind of ways this legislation could be used in ways against us and against our interests as women and girls.
So the law makes gender identity and sexual orientation part of the definition of sex when discussing discrimination on the basis of sex. So how does it actually define gender identity, and what are the implications of this definition?
So the law defines gender identity as the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think.
Do they ever define the word gender in this legislation?
No.
Okay.
They don't define sex either. Other than to say it includes, actually they do, they say, but they don't actually say what it is. They don't say that it's like the distinction between men and women, or that it refers, I think they use sex characteristics is what they use, and then intersex characteristics, pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So everything except sex.
It says the term sex includes a sex stereotype, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition, sexual orientation or gender identity, and sex characteristics, including intersex traits.
Right. So pregnancy is sex, and femininity is sex, but not sex.
And gender identity is in there as well. So gender identity is part of sex now.
Yes. Well, that's in the definition section. And so what they do is they put that in one section, and then these other sections, they say, we incorporate the definitions from this other section. So when they're making these edits, though, there's a statute that says, oh, discrimination on the basis of sex. And then they have these little line edits where they go in and say, strike sex, replace it with sex, parentheses, including sexual orientation and gender identity, parentheses. And they do that everywhere. And it's really interesting because they don't have to do that. There's the Fairness for All Act, which is kind of the Equality Act, but with religious exemptions is basically what it is. But it's almost identical other than the exemptions, but they actually have it as 3 separate characteristics. They don't include it in there. And so that was an intentional choice that was made for the Equality Act to say, no, we don't think of these as separate characteristics at all. We see them as the same. And
are there legal implications in doing it that way rather than as 3 separate categories?
Yeah, I think that the big elephant in the room is we know that it was probably done in a way to intentionally conflate gender identity with sex. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of places in the bill where they say that very explicitly. And I think that because there's been court cases that have found, like Bostock, that discriminating on the basis of a sexual orientation, for example, is sex discrimination. It's almost like they kind of went in there and said, okay, well, we're just going to put this all together. But I think we know if there wasn't the intent that to sort of end these single sex spaces or sex segregated sports, I don't think there would be any real reason. It's not very logical to keep them together. And actually, Sasha had mentioned, problems for protecting like LGBT rights on this basis. And I think, we have to remember too that the law is permitted or required to recognize sex in many, many places, actually. Something I didn't know until recently reading the Equality Act is that sex is actually not it's not prohibited to discriminate on sex in public accommodations or in federal funding. And the reason I didn't know that is because it apparently hasn't been really a problem, because that's how we get all the stuff that we want. That's how you can have a women's only gym. And that's how you can, have women's shelters formerly. And that's, how you can do all of those things, is because it's illegal to discriminate against men. So this adds that. And even without the issue of adding gender identity into it, we could have still been running into these same problems where you have a man who identifies as anything saying, hey, Title VI over here says that you can't discriminate based on sex in federal funding, so you can't have this women's shelter and not serve men, leaving gender identity out of it. And the reverse is true too. If all they added was gender identity and sexual orientation and weren't adding sex, then sex discrimination would still be permissible. We'd still have that semantic fight, of like, well, what does it really mean? And how can you, but it wouldn't be, this is actually really serious that they're adding both of these characteristics, because it's going to make it doubly difficult to defend against. And we don't have any existing case law in these areas which says, yes, you can have women's only stuff, because it's completely new territory.
So how do we protect women's only spaces in law? What's the need there as you see it?
Well, we don't pass the Equality Act.
In terms of like the wording and what should be the protected characteristics? How should that work?
Well, maybe this is digging into the weeds too much, but you have to ask, I'm going to put sexual orientation aside for now, because they're not the same thing. And people don't get fired from jobs for the exact same reasons based on those characteristics. But are people being fired because they're non-conforming with, sex-based stereotypes because they don't look masculine or feminine enough? Is it because they have done medical treatments which make them maybe look a little bit more like the opposite sex, or sort of ambiguous? If we can't define what the characteristic is, then we can't protect against it. And so to just say it's the gender-related identity, and you go back to it and it's appearance, mannerisms, whatever, that literally is the definition of sex stereotype. But that's not what they mean, because they're also talking about the belief. It's not a sex stereotype for a man to use the women's room, or to, like, it's not a stereotype that he has to use the men's room. It's just not.
A little more about what that means about the sex stereotyping, and where would that matter in employment for, let's say?
Yeah, so there's been limited case law, and this was something that the Supreme Court just examined in Bostock, where there was this really famous case, Price Waterhouse, and this woman was passed over for a partnership because she was too masculine in personality, mostly, I think, was what it was she was too aggressive, she was too this, she outperformed all her male colleagues. And she sued them because this was earlier on in society when they felt comfortable telling her to her face that she wasn't feminine enough. And that's why she wasn't getting it. And she sued them. And they were like, look, we have all these female partners that we've promoted, and we have all these male partners with these same personality characteristics. And the Supreme Court agreed that that was still sex discrimination. And so one of the things that the Bostock court could have done is expanded that and said, this applies to, this other stuff. And I don't know if you noticed the facts of that case where the plaintiff was fired, not for coming to work and saying, I'm transgender or I identify as a woman. It was the Stevens, Harris Funeral Homes in Stevens' case. And it was because, the employee gave notice to the employer that he was going to start, they had a sex specific dress code where men can wear this, men can wear that. It was a funeral home. So it was, formal attire or however. And they said, well, I'm going on vacation. And when I come back, I'm going to be following the female dress code and I'm going to start using the women's facilities. And the employer was like, no. And then, the employee sued and won. And unfortunately actually died before the end of that case, which is sad. But at any rate, the Supreme Court did not address the facts of the case because, I don't know if you know this, in the decision, they specifically say that we are not addressing restrooms and locker rooms and anything like that under Title VII. And it's like, well, why are we here? That's exactly what we were here to talk about. Why? Instead, they found this transgender status. And so the ruling says that if you come to work and say, self-identify yourself as the opposite sex, that's protected. But it was silent on the issue of single sex spaces. So how do you do it? I don't know, but not like this. I think that the other thing they do in the UK is they have their own Equality Act that's like 10 years old now. And they created 9 protected characteristics. It was this big civil rights bill to replace a bunch of old ones. And they have sex as a protected characteristic, and they have what they call gender reassignment as one. And that is, it's very broad. It says if the moment a person sort of declares their intention to someday in the future transition, and transition's very broadly defined too, that's protected. So that really would, if you went into your job and said, oh, I identify as a man now, you couldn't be fired for that. And it includes that whole spectrum of can't be fired for taking hormones or having surgery or for changing my name to a different, like that kind of stuff. And so I do think something like that would be very protective for that, group of people. However, I'm concerned about, women and girls, and we have seen that that is not a good solution. It has been abused over there as well. Their civil rights bill allows for single sex spaces, and that's not what's happening. They're letting people with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment into single sex spaces, including prisons. There's sexual assaults happening. There's all sorts of stuff going on that we can expect to ramp up here if the Equality Act is passed.
So Lauren, how does this relate to having a different role when you have employees where you would maybe want men to do one specific role, like for example, prison guards or at a domestic violence shelter? Well, now they have to, not discriminate on the basis of gender identity for these different occupational roles?
Yeah, so, and that's a good point because that gets to a lot of things. And one of the things the Equality Act specifically does is so right now the Civil Rights Act says that sex can sometimes be a bona fide occupational qualification, which means it's generally illegal to discriminate based on sex. Sex is not supposed to be relevant in hiring unless it's relevant to the job. So the big ones that we know there are like a gym teacher who's supervising kids in the shower and locker room, same sex. Prison guard, TSA, security guard, pat downs and strip searches, same sex. You're getting a pelvic exam, you can request a provider of the same sex or be chaperoned, but the same. So there's a whole bunch of areas in which this can happen. And they're considered exceptions to the rule because it's to meet a public need. It's not for the benefit of the employee. In fact, it has the tendency to not benefit the employee because you see these care homes where all these elderly women are requesting, female intimate cares. And so just like it's the circle of life, they're the only ones, changing diapers and stuff because the men can't. But it's because of serving the public. So that means that it's not illegal to tell a male employee that he can't go do those things. But the Equality Act specifically says that sex can no longer be a bona fide occupational qualification unless someone can be recognized in accordance with their gender identity. And that's really unfortunate because it's not supposed to exist as a civil right for the employee. It's supposed to be for that other thing. And if you're not even going to define gender identity, what does it mean? Recognized in accordance with your appearance and mannerisms of, like, what does that mean? It's really disappointing. It's really disappointing that the Democrats support this because they're supposed to be the ones who have the deep understanding of women's needs and care about that. And to see them go so far off the rails is a little bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Where do you recommend people go to learn more? Where might they start if they want to sort of uncover some of more details about this stuff? Where should they look?
Well, I mean, you can follow Wolf on Twitter at Women's Lib Front, or go to www.womensliberationfront.org. We have got lots of information. We've got polling. We've got different analysis of this and of other state level bills. And just keep reading and don't read the headlines and don't, they're not speaking about the media in general. Okay, so I'm paranoid, but they're not talking about this in a logical, neutral way. MK made this brilliant media guide, which, is like a kindergarten level. Here's how you actually talk about this stuff that we all have forgotten how to talk about. I was gonna say, if the other negative of putting these things together means that if we're going to have, jobs that we say are okay to only have for women or only have for men for the purpose of meeting a public need, then where does that fit in with having sexual orientation in there? Because you're gonna have people who argue that if it's okay to discriminate against men, then it could be okay to discriminate against lesbians. Or if it's okay, you know what I mean? Like, oh, well, if men shouldn't be doing this intimate personal care for this person in a hospital, then a lesbian shouldn't either. And having some of that moral panic in there. So I feel like whoever chose to do that really was not thinking about the needs of same-sex attracted people, because you're basically giving them a license to say we can either have no sex segregated single sex spaces, or maybe we shouldn't have gay men in the men's shower either. Like that kind of logic. It doesn't make any sense.
And is that given license here in the Equality Act?
Well, you're putting it at risk because you're putting it in a situation where you're saying that all of these characteristics are kind of a part of this. And so rather than saying these are separate things, because that's what I would do. I would say, no, you can never tell. That's my thing. You're male and you're male, or you're female and you're female. And regardless of that, I would wrap it into that. Say sex stereotypes, maybe sexual orientation, gender identity, making sure you're defining gender identity as like a belief so that that person's belief is protected regardless of how objectively unserious it is. But that's okay. You believe it and that's fine. And we're not going to fire you over it. If you have all of those things wrapped up and then you say it's not okay to discriminate based on those things, you can actually preserve the right to discriminate based on sex, which is not intuitive, but really protects women in that way. And then you don't have to bring the other stuff into it. You can just have that other conversation, but they don't really want to have that conversation. They would prefer to just self-ID sex, and this is what it means now.
So Lauren, I wonder about the flip side of saying, okay, so we want some discrimination on the basis of sex, but obviously we don't want a lot of it because that has historically harmed women. So where is the middle ground on that? Is there like a way that you can define it that you would say this is when discrimination is okay? And what does law that's existing do, and what does the proposed law do?
So we have it's not in the Constitution. So courts have long interpreted sex discrimination as being subject to heightened scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, which means that it's okay sometimes but you have to have an extremely good reason. And that has really been a high bar. There's been, I mean, if you think about really look around in your life and think about the stuff that's legal or illegal to discriminate based on sex, there's really not structural barriers to women's access to public life, to education, to jobs, to housing, and all of that stuff. We know that there are kind of substructural things, and there's obviously cultural and social and economic barriers, but there's nothing that says, you know, oh, you can do that thing. So I think that the way we look at it now works. And if you want to increase it to like strict scrutiny where you can't ever discriminate on that basis, then you run into problems where you can't have single sex spaces. And you know, you look at the expansion and there's so much wrong with the Equality Act. Actually, they expand the public accommodations definition, and then you take away the ability to discriminate based on sex. What does that do for salons and spas? Canada, Jonathan Yaniv. Yeah, if you say in public accommodations, which they specifically include a spa or salon, and you can't discriminate based on sex or based on gender identity, there's nothing that doesn't allow a man to come in and say, I want you to serve my, you know, I don't know what kind of podcast this is.
Yeah, well, it's a wax my balls kind of podcast.
Yes, wax my balls. There's the right. So I think of the Equality Act as a men's rights, civil rights bill. I truly do. I don't mean that in any kind of exaggeration. I don't see almost any benefit in it for women. There's like a couple of little scraps like, oh, maybe it'll be easier to get an abortion, but like nothing concrete even. There's nothing that's like, so, I mean, I don't know, that's.
We've even seen men's rights activists online supporting the Equality Act and advocating for it as a piece of legislation that they see advancing their cause.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I think it's a good note to end on because we are running out of time. Thank you so much, Lauren. And
all right. Thanks, guys.
Conversation.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.